Well, welcome back. It's time to go on to Chapter 4 in our study of processing and programming in general, and that means we're going to talk about selection. So, let's get started. In this chapter, we're going to deal with decision making, and there's basically two different types of decision making that we're going to do. First of all, we'll do true or false decisions with the if statement. We'll talk about the so-called one-armed if first, talk a little bit about coding style when we talk about code blocks, and then we'll cover the other version of the if, the two-armed if statement. Once we're done with the ifs, then we'll look at how to make multiple choice decisions with the switch statement. Then we'll cover a little bit from processing when we talk about typography, that is how to display fonts and text on our display window when we run our sketches. And we'll finish up with the idea of nesting control structures. And our crowning example for the chapter will be a MP3 player that actually plays 4 songs instead of just 1. All right, so let's motivate things a little bit here with sort of an introductory question. So if you think about all the sketches or the programs that we've walked through so far, what have all of their flowcharts had in common? If you can visualize those, you'll realize that they've all been linear. That is, they've all started at the top, flowed straight through to the bottom. There haven't been any choices or decisions made in there. There's only one way to get from the start of the program to the end. Well, in this chapter, what we're going to do is essentially put forks into the lines in a flowchart. That is, put branches in so that there's more than one way to go through the program. And what that lets us do is it lets us write code that changes what it does at runtime, which makes it much more versatile, okay? So that it can do one thing or another thing at runtime based on the conditions there. The first way we're going to do that is with our if statement. And as we said in the outline, the if statement allows us to make programs that make true or false decisions, okay? So the program can do one thing or something else at runtime. Okay? It has one or two options, and it chooses between those options at runtime when the program's running based on conditions inside the program. Okay? So that's really important because then our code doesn't have to be rewritten every time to behave differently every time it runs. Based on its input, the things that happen in the program at that time, it can do one thing or another. And for if statements, that decision making is based on the value of some sort of a Boolean expression. If you recall back to Chapter 2, Booleans are things which are true or false. Okay, so let's start by looking at the one-armed if statement. And this is a flowchart showing what the one-armed if statement looks like. So obviously this is just a fragmentary flowchart, just showing how this particular statement works. We would start here, we flow into some expression that is evaluated, and that can only be true or false. If that expression evaluates to false, then nothing happens and we come right out the bottom. Okay? If that expression happens to be true, then one or more statements that are associated with that expression are executed. Okay? So in our flowcharts, a diamond represents a decision that's made based on some value. And in the case of a one-armed if statement, that's a Boolean expression, and if that expression is true, then the body of that if statement is executed. Now syntactically, here's what an if statement looks like. This is just an example, so this is not code that you would write that would actually work, but it shows you the pattern that you would follow. So we have our keyword if, and then in parentheses we have some Boolean expression, something that evaluates to true or false. Then after that we have the statements that we want to be executed if that expression happens to be true. Okay? So if the expression is true, then the program executes that body of statements, otherwise that body is skipped entirely. Okay. Now, before we move on to our first little example, let's talk about code blocks. If it's the case that there's just one statement in the body of an if statement, then you can leave the curly brackets out. On the other hand, if there are multiple statements in the body of the if statement, then you have to use curly brackets to delimit the body. Our coding style is to use them all the time. Okay, so even when you don't need them, please use them. That will help you avoid some simple mistakes. Okay, what we're talking about is in this syntax template, these curly brackets here. So every time you write an if statement, start a curly bracket, close that curly bracket, and then come back and fill in the details. Okay? All right, so we're going to go ahead and move on to a little bit of a practice piece. What we want is an application that uses dialog-based input. And it'll have a setup and a draw method. And our dialog-based input statements will go in setup. We're going to use that dialog to prompt the user to enter their name. Once they enter their name, then the application is going to draw a display window with a red background. If the user's name happens to be longer than 10 characters, the display window should have a green background instead. Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll break, do a little bit of a chop talk about how we're going to design this, and then implement it.